Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Listen with Vobes. Very nice to see you. I feel like we're a bit zoomed in on the old camera there. I hope I'm not too close for comfort. But anyway, there we are. Hope you all had a lovely weekend. Sorry, just adjusting my sound. I think my sound was a little low then. 1, 2, 3. There we go. 1, 2, 3. About there. Hello and welcome to another Listen with Vobes. I'm Richard Vobes and we are reading London Belongs to Me by Norman Collins. And we're about a quarter of the way through now. It's all heating up, the story's getting on. Hello to Turbo Stream from a warmish shire today. It's very warm down here in West Sussex. Hello to the lovely Julia, Dave Ivad, Philip and Mary from sunny Bognor. And Jen Colley, Audrey Forbes Hamilton, Billabong O'Neill, Zom Coco, and Tall Podge Rog. It's very nice to see you. Thank you very much for tuning in. And to everybody else who's tuned in who haven't said hello, it's nice to have you with us this afternoon. Shame to be inside on such a sunny day here in Worthing, and maybe where you are it's also sunny. Sensible Paul has arrived. He says, afternoon all, wonder what Percy's going to get up to this week. Yes. Is he going to evade the law or has he got away with it? We will find out. I've got a lemon and ginger to help me struggle through the old reading today. Is it me or are my glasses a bit wibbly wobbly? Probably a bit wibbly wobbly there, getting a bit knackered now. Dudley Sawyer, good afternoon. Just back from sitting on the bench. You're allowed to do that now. So you can sit in front of any policeman you like and go, I'm on the bench, nothing you could do. Which is great. Hello to Michael White as well. Good afternoon. We are on chapter 21, ladies and gentlemen. So let's crack on, shall we, and see how we get on. Chapter 21. It was a Sunday evening, and Mr. Squales and Connie were on their way to Hyde Park Drive together. They were in a taxi now, but they'd only climbed into it for appearance sake at 100 yards or so up the road, and the earlier part of the ride had been slower and less fashionable, much slower because Dulcimer Street and Hyde Park Drive were remote islands in the complicated archipelago of London. There was no direct channel joining them. There could be no question about it. It would have been easier by underground, but the underground was no good for Connie. She couldn't stand the feeling of being buried. It was just one of those things. There were, in fact, so many of those things with Connie that Mr. Squales wished already that he hadn't brought her. But it was too late now. He had to endure it. All the same, there remained the question of her clothes. Because it was a warm night, Connie had come out in something that she called her summery mummery. It was of brightly flowered of brightly flowered violi and very thin. And it was the thinness that was the trouble. It was absolutely transparent. Beneath the short ruffled sleeves could be seen the thick ridge of what looked like sensible winter underwear. Not that Connie had taken trouble with herself. When Mr. Squales told her that her arms, her thin, wrinkly arms, looked too bare, she'd gone straight upstairs and borrowed a pair of long lemon suede ones from Mrs. Boone. Mr. Squales made no comment on the gloves. What he had really meant was a coat. Another thing was that Connie would talk to him. She had a high, piercing voice, rather like an agitated child's, and it jarred. At one of the changes, he brought an evening paper and gave it to her, but it was no use. She read him all the titbits aloud as she came to them. As soon as they were in the taxi, Mr. Squales took the paper away from her again and addressed her. Now, Connie, he said firmly, I want you to remember everything I told you. This is really a very solemn occasion, not a funny one. An unhappy widow is trying to get in touch with her dear departed. Keep on trying to think of that. Keep on trying to think of it in that way. You're trying to help me. If Miss Jan Bill asks how long you've been working for me, you'd better seem to be trying to work it out and then say something about how exhausted I am after every séance. Something about fainting in the taxi would be good. And don't forget, when I raise my foot, you say, "He's off." That's important. We don't want to be there all night. Mr. Squales paused. "I'll give you the half-guinea tomorrow," he said. "Don't ask for it in front of Mrs. Jan Bill." 10 6 it is, Connie answered. They had reached the house by now, and Mr. Swales had just rung. The door opened, and he gave a little bow. "Professor Qualito and assistant," he announced. So he's taking Connie as his assistant to this séance. What could possibly go wrong? I mean, it is a farce. It is absolutely a farce. Oh, my God. They made a rather lonely little group as they sat in the big drawing room waiting for Mrs. Jan Bill to arrive. Fortunately, they were comfortable. Mr. Squales' chair was so deeply upholstered that his knees were above the level of his chin, and Connie was lying practically full length on a deep rose-red couch. The room was undeniably well furnished. Indeed, it was more than furnished. It was appointed. The inlaid desk with the gilt legs and enormous claw feet over by the window was obviously Louis, Mr. Squales told himself. Obviously genuine French Louis. Oh, Louis, as in presumably Louis the King of France. They've spelt it Loowe. W-E-E, Louis, French Louis. And the porcelain shepherdess on the side table was obviously genuine Dresden or Wedgwood. Mr. Squales couldn't quite remember which, but whatever they were clearly genuine. Indeed, this quality of genuineness ran right through the room. Even from where he was sitting, he could see the hallmark of the period inkwell. But it wasn't any of these things that he was looking at now. He was looking at the photographs. There was rather a lot of them, all over the room, mounted in elaborate silver frames, and they were all of the same man. Mr. Squales went round and inspected them in turn. So far as he was concerned, there were so many clues staring at him. There was not much to be gained from them, however. It was a flat, unexciting kind of face, a Dutch face, in fact, with a pale, drooping moustache and a small, pointed head. Not a small, pointed head, a small, pointed beard. "So that's what you look like, is it?" Mr. Squales said musingly. I'd pictured you a lot larger." Only this morning he'd been doing some research on Mr. Jan Bill. He had looked up his obituary notice in the Times, and by now he was, by the way of being, quite an authority on him. That melancholy visage with the dark pondering eyes was the picture of the man who had made a corner in the soft cheese market and had left £100,000 to a chest hospital. Then, when Mr. Scales was still studying one of the photographs, in fact, Mrs. Jan Bill came in. She was an impressive woman, and she dominated. Mr. Squales had risen as she entered, but Mrs. Jan Bill was casual and imperious. A mere backward flip of the fingers as though to warn him that if he didn't move out of the way, she would run him down. And, having cleared a path for herself, she passed him with the rustle of silk and soft, and a strong waft of perfume, and sat down in the big throne-like chair with the lamp beside it. Getting out her lorgnette, she scrutinised her visitors. Mr. Squale disliked being examined through the lorgnette. It made him feel inferior. He longed for the monocle that had been worn with the light check suit during the happy days of summer down at Brighton, but he doubted whether even the monocle would have been a strong enough magic to save him. It was one thing using a monocle on a lot of defenceless natives, but Mrs. Jan Bill's lorgnette was of inlaid tortoiseshell on a gold chain. It was colossal. "There's a dressing-room next to you if you want to change, Professor," was all she said. But Mr. Squales only shook his head. He had no intention of whatever leaving Mrs. Jan Bill and Connie together alone. "Then shall we begin?" Mrs. Jan Bill asked impatiently. "I'm quite ready as soon as you've composed yourself." The only light came from a shaded standard lamp that cast a small circular pool of brightness on the polished floor. All round the shadows gathered mysteriously. Mr. Squales was reclining on the couch, his head supported by a cushion, his eyes shut. Opposite him sat Mrs. Jan Bill. She was in a small semicircular armchair that fitted her so tightly that she seemed to be wearing it. Her head was bent slightly forward, and there was a tense, alert kind of expression on her face, as though she was ready at any moment's warning to jump up, chair and all. In between them, on a kind of footstool, perched Connie. Mrs. Jan Bill leant over and whispered to her. "Is he quite comfortable, do you think?" she asked. "Is there anything he'd like?" For a moment, Connie studied the slowly breathing form on the couch. "He might like another drink," she said. As she said it, a quiver ran through the medium, almost as though the moment of possession had come to him. But all that happened was that he raised one of his long, sensitive hands and waved it reprovingly. "Nothing at all now, thank you, nothing at all. But please go on talking, it helps me." There was a pause. "We shouldn't have asked him," Connie observed. "We should have just put it by him." "Chakva Ali always fasts before a big séance," Mrs. Jan Bill replied. Connie raised her eyebrows. "Some like it one way and others like it another," she replied. "I had to help Mr. Squales out of the taxi before now." Another quiver ran through the medium, and Connie corrected herself. Not that you mean either," she said to Mrs. Jan Bill. "Just, what, not what you mean either," she said to Mrs. Jan Bill. "Just exhaustion." It was Mr. Squales who interrupted them. He was anxious to bring the conversation to a close. "Quiet now, please," he said, his voice fading away to nothingness. "I feel myself drifting. "You watch out," whispered Connie. "You're in for something good. It's the surprise of your life you're getting." After the room was silent, except for the sound of Mr. Squales's breathing — it was a low, regular sibilance that seemed different from ordinary breathing. It was deeper and slower, the breathing of a profound sleeper, of an exhausted lover, of a man near to death, and it should have been pretty good breathing. Mr. Squales had been practising it long enough. Then a change came over him. He was restful no longer. He was choking now, just lying there in front of him, throttling himself. The air that he was swallowing might have been in solid chunks from the way he was biting at it. Very slowly, the left leg rose into the air. But Connie wasn't looking at the moment. She had never imagined that Mr. Squales was such a good actor, and the whole performance made her feel quite queer. It was after the left leg had raised itself for the third time that Mrs. Janbill called her attention to it. Connie pulled herself together hurriedly. "That's his signal," she said impulsively. "He's ready." Even so, they had to wait a minute or two, 2 minutes, 3 in fact, before anything happened. And then a voice began speaking. It wasn't like Mr. Squales at all. It was very low and guttural, and it spoke in a faint foreign accent. "Good evening, loved one," it said. "How I've missed you. I cannot tell you what separation means. It is like having a knife pass through me. It makes me bleed." The voice ceased for a moment, and Connie could hear that Mrs. Janbill was breathing heavily too. "But in a way, I am happy too. The air is like balm, and I draw in sweet breaths of it. I suffer no pain." "Go on," Mrs. Janbill commanded. She was leaning right forward now, so that the chair seemed no look more than a tiny bustle behind her. "And I am happy because I see your face, your dear face around me. It is in the flowers, in the clouds, and in the stars above me." "He's certainly going it," thought Connie delightedly. "She'll burst her bodice in a moment." But before the voice could speak again, Mrs. Janbill had asked it a question. "What was your mother's first name?" she asked. The voice hesitated. "Wilhelmina," it said, uttering the only Dutch name that it knew. Mrs. Janbill drew her lips tighter. "And when was your sister born?" she demanded. In The Hague." "Oh, when?" "In The Hague," the voice told her. "I said when," Mrs. Janbill reminded him. This time the voice didn't answer immediately. It just stayed somewhere inside Mr. Squales, saying nothing. And when at last it came through, it was distinctly petulant. "But these are trivial questions," it complained. "They are frivolous. I have a message for you. A great message, something that is like a shaft of light through the darkness. I am a light bearer." Mrs. Janbill had sat back abruptly in the chair. Reaching over her shoulder, she pulled the pendant switch and the tall standard lamp. The light made Connie blink, but when she could see, she looked at Mrs. Janbill's direction. She was sitting there with her arms crossed. "You mean you're an imposter?" Mrs. Janbill contradicted him. What? Have I missed a page? No. "I've had plenty of your sort before. Now, you can get up now. You're only wasting my time lying there." There was a silence, a strained, awkward silence. Even the breathing on the couch seemed to have stopped. Connie roused herself. "Don't do anything," she advised. "There may be a bit of a mix-up. Perhaps the late lamented be coming through in a minute." Mrs. Janbill rounded on her. "And you're an accomplice," she said. "I ought to make the pair of you go over to the police. You're nothing but a pair of cheap charlatans." A faint sound from the couch, a sound like a dry, rasping cough, made them both turn round. It came very obviously from Mr. Squales's direction, but it hadn't come from Mr. Squales. His lips were still closed, and while they listened, the husky, hollow cough came again. Mrs. Janbill gripped Connie's arm. "What's that?" she asked. "Search me," Connie said. They went across to the couch together and stood over Mr. Squales. Even in the half-light he looked somehow different. His chest, with the broad black stock flowing over was no longer rising and falling as it had been. It seemed to have stopped altogether, and his face was now chalky pale. It was like the face of a comfortably dead man. The lower jaw had dropped down, and his upper denture was sagging. All Mr. Squale's self-respect had gone from him. "Get up," Mrs. Jan Beale said roughly. "Get up and leave the house." But Mr. Squales apparently couldn't hear her. He just lay there, and while he looked, his eyebrows slowly rolled back into his face, and his eyes stared up at the ceiling. The pupils had contracted, and the light catching them made them glint as though they were luminous. Mrs. Jan Beale drew back a little. He's fainted," she said, haltingly. She turned away to ring the bell, but before she could reach it, someone addressed her prematurely. "Stay where you are," she was told. And it was not Mrs. Squales who had spoken. His lips were still drooping, and in any case the voice didn't seem to be coming from him. It came from a point about 2 feet above his placid figure. It was the voice without a body, an invisible mouth opening in the air. And the room had suddenly grown cold, unutterably cold. It was as though a frigid, unboisterous wind were blowing through the closed doors and curtained windows, and freezing everything, as though slow waves of iciness were emanating from the body of the silent medium. Connie shivered. Then the voice began speaking again. "Why can't you leave me alone?" it had asked again. "Why won't you ever leave me alone? Not even now?" It was a flat, weary voice that was speaking, the voice of a man who'd had all the sparkle trodden out of him. "I don't want to come when they sent for me. I was better off where I was, a lot better off. I just wanted to be left alone." The voice paused, interrupted by the same recurrent cough. "I don't believe you ever knew how much I got to hate you," it went on. "You and your grand ways and everything about you. That's why I left all the money to the hospital. You did your best to stop it, but I was ready for you. I left everything tied up. If I'd been a bit braver, I'd have left you. Not gone after another woman, just left you. Just walked out and left you sitting there. I thought about it often enough. I just hadn't got the courage." "Stop him," Mrs. Jan Beale cried out. "Don't let him say any more. He doesn't know what he's doing." But the voice didn't seem to hear her. It went on in the same flat voice as before. "And do you know what the first thing was they said to me up here when I told them? They said, 'Well, why didn't you? It's too late now.' That's what they said. They don't think much of me up here." The voice was getting fainter now, but they could still hear it speaking. "Don't send for me again," it said. "I don't want to come. I've had enough of you. I just want to be left alone. I want to think things out." The voice had stopped altogether, and the room seemed to grow warmer. Connie took a deep breath and glanced across at Mrs. Jan Beale, but Mrs. Jan Beale was past noticing. She was lolling back in the armchair, crying. They were in the taxi going home now. Connie had pretty much nearly carried Mr. Squales downstairs and lifted him into it. He just sat there, passing a handkerchief across his face and shivering. It must have been one of those unaccountable attacks that had come on over him. He'd have to certainly see the specialist if they went on. Was I a success?" he asked, feebly. Connie gave a little giggle. "A success?" she answered. "You're a knockout." And we are now on chapter 22. Percy was standing at the window, looking out across the street, just standing there. He'd been like that for nearly 5 minutes. He didn't go out so much in the evening now. It felt safer indoors. Mrs. Boone looked up from her mending. Her face, for some reason, looked sadder than ever tonight. An expression of resignation and defeat seemed to have settled down on it. "Why don't you do something, Percy?" she asked. "Just standing there?" He was so jumpy that he stared when she spoke to him. But he couldn't admit that he was jumpy, couldn't admit that there was anything wrong with him. He felt betrayed that his mother had even noticed that there was anything wrong. It was as though she weren't on his side after all, as though he weren't so safe with her as he'd thought. "I'm all right, Mum," was all he said. Mrs. Boone continued to stare across at him. There was something about him that reminded her of him as he had been when he was a little boy. She never saw him as his real age. He was fixed in her mind, photographed, as it were, somewhere around the age of 7 or 8, rather as a delicate little boy, tall for his years, in a jersey and blue corduroy trousers. He'd had those silly, difficult fits even then. "Why don't you go out for a walk?" "Don't want to walk." "You used to like it, all right," Mrs. Boone went on. "You weren't never in." She was no longer looking at him. Her eyes were down on the mending again. Percy turned on her. "Oh, shut up, Mum, can't you?" he said. "First you nag me because I'm always out, and now you're nagging me because I stop in." "Oh, Percy." There were tears in Mrs. Boone's eyes as she spoke. She couldn't help it. It was silly minding about Percy like that, but he was all she had. She couldn't bear it when he was cross with her. But Percy had turned his back on her again and was looking down the street once more. "There isn't anything worrying you, is there?" she asked. Percy shook his head. "I'm all right," he said. Then Mrs. Boone screwed up her courage. She had to do so. She and Percy had never discussed his private affairs together. "Not a girl or anything, is it, Percy?" She was sorry as soon as she'd said it, because she was afraid that it would make him angry, but she hadn't anticipated that it would make him as angry as all this. He rounded on her. "What you going on at me for?" he demanded. "I asked you to shut up, didn't I?" Before Mrs. Boone could answer, he had crossed the room and had gone over to the door. He stood there for a moment, his hands resting on the handle, and Mrs. Boone looked at him. She noticed again how ill and pallid he seemed. There were dark circles under his eyes. Too much smoking, that was it, or not sleeping. She'd heard him tossing about at night lately. "All right," he said abruptly. "I'll go out if you don't want me here." It was about 8 o'clock when he pulled the front door shut behind him, and he went straight down the steps, even though he hadn't decided where to go. He was feeling anxiously in his pockets for the cigarettes. "Perhaps I'll feel better if I have a walk," he told himself. "Get a walk and have a drink. Go to the pictures if it wasn't so late. Go to the pictures if they'd got anything decent on." He looked at his watch, the gold wristwatch that Mrs. Boone had given him, and then pulled his cuff down again. "Reckon I'll go for a walk," he decided. "Just go round the streets and try and walk it off. Perhaps I'll feel better if I get a walk." He turned automatically in the direction of Dove Street, but on the way he stopped suddenly and drew himself up flat up against the railings so he shouldn't be noticed. And all because he'd looked ahead of him and seen 2 men in sports coats and flannel trousers standing on the street corner in front. He stood there without moving long enough to see the 2 men saunter slowly off towards the oval. It looked okay, but how was he to know that they hadn't spotted him before he'd spotted them and had noticed what was happening? How was he to know that? And it couldn't just be coincidence. He always sees men in sports coats and flannels nowadays, men in proper plainclothes uniform standing about where they could see him. There'd been a man that he hadn't liked the look of standing outside the garage for nearly an hour this morning. And 2 nights ago, someone had followed him home. He was sure of it. He'd noticed him right up by the Kennington Park Road, and he'd been still behind him by the time Percy had turned into number 10. That man, whoever he was, knew where Percy lived all right. So he turned round and walked off quickly in the opposite direction. If those 2 narcs thought they were going to pounce on him as he came out round the corner, they were in for a big disappointment. He'd like to see their faces. Then, as he walked on, I mustn't look over my shoulder. That'll give 'em something on me, he told himself. He realised how foolish it was. He told himself. Then he realised how foolish it was. There wasn't any men waiting for him at the corner. He wasn't being followed. It was just nerves that made him imagine them. Why should anyone be following him? He was just Percy Boone, one of 10 million. He'd had a bit of trouble. His little bit of trouble was a secret between himself and Percy Boone Esquire. And if Percy Boone Esquire didn't feel like it, and if Percy Boone didn't feel like talking, that was that, wasn't it? And where did they go from here? Then he remembered the drink that he'd been going to have. Perhaps that's what he needed. Perhaps that would do him good. Other people had drinks and felt better for them. What was beer anyway? It didn't have any kick in it. He wanted something hard. Large gin and a baby tonic, or a double Hagen soda, something with fireworks. Over on the opposite corner stood Clarchan. I don't know what that is. Percy crossed over and went into it. Almost as soon as he was inside, he knew he'd done the right thing. The saloon bar was full of noise, cheerful noise. There was a loudspeaker on the shelf among the bottles, and a shiny cascade of hot dance music was bubbling out over it. In the corner, a couple of pin tables were pinging and clattering, and all around the bar there was a huddle of drinkers talking about happy things like dog racing and a big fight and themselves. "I'd done the right thing coming here," he repeated to himself. Better than outside. I'd done the right thing." But had he? He wondered almost immediately. There was one big difference between him and the others. He wasn't really one of them. They were all in groups of 2s and 3s, and he was all alone. He was the only person alone in that bar. "I ought to have brought someone along with me," he told himself. "I ought to have brought someone to talk to. No fun drinking by yourself, not even whiskey. I ought to have brought someone along with me." He was so lonely that he didn't want to drink. Usually whiskey was reliable. It made you feel different while it was still going down. But tonight, it didn't. It just reminded him of things. "It's Doris I want," he told himself. "Little Doris here beside me. My little darling with her arm through mine. I'd do anything for Doris. Only I've got to ask for it, and it's hers. Only got to ask for it, and it's hers. I'd buy it. I'd buy her a Bronx or a passion fruit nectar or a Pimm's number 1, or soft if she'd rather. She knows that. She knows I'd give her the moon if she cried for it. I don't mind what it costs if she asked for it. It's Doris I want." Then an appalling thing happened. Because he was so lonely, and because Doris was over at Hampstead in that flat of hers, he began thinking about the blonde. And for a moment his mind was divided right down the middle, cut clean in 2 parts. And one half didn't know what the other half was up to. "Why shouldn't I go along and see her?" he asked himself. "She likes me. She'll be there waiting. Why shouldn't I go?" Then there was a click, and the 2 halves came together again. He realised what he'd done. He'd been planning a date with the dead girl. That shook him badly, made him lose confidence, in fact. "Going balmy, that's me," he told himself. "Going balmy." But he was all right now. He could afford to laugh, but not much, at his mistake. And It wasn't because of the whiskey either. It was because a real good idea, a proper brainwave, had just come to him. Why shouldn't he do what he really wanted? Why shouldn't he go and see Doris? There wasn't any law against it, was there? Why shouldn't he? All the same, he needed a bit of face to do it, and Doris didn't know how much he felt about her, or did she? Women were supposed to know that men felt that way. It was some sixth sense or something, and he'd got to see her, got to. He'd go mad if he didn't. He glanced at his watch. 8:30. That was all right. If he went up now, he'd be in Hampstead by 9, and in his excitement, he could picture it all happening. He'd rung the bell, a rather posh sort of front door bell in a big block of Mason flats, and Doris herself was there to let him in. "Why, Percy, this is a surprise. Come in." Quickening his pace, he set off. It's all very exciting, isn't it? It took a long time on the bus, longer than he'd reckoned. And the funny thing was that the excitement suddenly wore off. It just evaporated. At one moment, the bus was toiling along past the Black Cat factory in the Hampstead Road, and there he was in the front seat, all sticky and eager, thinking, "I'll be seeing you, my little darling. We'll be together again. You'll be mine for keeps one day. I'll be seeing you, my little darling." And at the next, he was wondering why he'd come, just like that. Perhaps it had been the whiskey after all. He wasn't going to go back now, not after coming all this way. It wouldn't make sense. In any case, he liked it over this side of London. There wasn't anyone who knew him there. It was safer. If it hadn't been for his old mum, he'd have taken a room over Camden Town and made a fresh start. He was still thinking about that when he found that he wasn't going right. He was still thinking about that when he found he wasn't going right. The bus had turned off suddenly and he was actually being taken away from Chalk Farm Station. As soon as the conductor told him what was happening, he did one of his flying get-offs and started to walk back. It was a long way. Chalk Farm itself was far enough, but the Adelaide Road only started there. There was miles of it, and it wasn't quite so good class as he had expected. Okay, but not ritzy. And the flat itself wasn't the least what he'd imagined. Even after he'd reached the house, he couldn't be sure. Twice he got back to the bottom of the flight of the iron stairs, and each time he went back, he went round to the front to see if it was really the right address. Then, on the third attempt, he plucked up his courage and began to mount in the direction of the little sign that said "Studio." His heart was hammering again by now. Because they weren't expecting him, he had to ring twice before anyone answered. Then the light came on and a door opened to him. It was full in his face, the light, and for a moment he couldn't be sure who was standing there. Then he saw it was Doreen. "Hello," he said, awkwardly. Doreen stared. "Who is it?" she asked. "Don't expect you remember me," he explained. "Met you over at my place when you came to see Doris." "Oh, is it Doris you want, is it?" Doreen asked. Very cool, no invitation in her voice. "That's right," Percy told her, smiling politely. It wasn't easy. He was having to be pleasant for both of them. "As a matter of fact, you're unlucky," Doreen said, still in the same offhand manner. "She's out." Percy paused. He hadn't allowed for this one. For a moment, Doreen had floored him. But only for a moment. "Expecting her back soon?" he asked. "Yes," Doreen answered, doubtfully. "Shouldn't be long. Would you like to come in and wait?" "Thanks," said Percy. "Don't mind if I do." As he said it, he was aware that she was pouting at him. She was cross about something, but she couldn't go back on her word. She'd invited him, hadn't she? And then, as soon as he got inside, he understood everything. She'd got a man there. Percy saw his hat and gloves, canary yellow ones, on the table by the door. He'd broken in on something, and as soon as he saw the way the cushions were on the couch, he knew what. The man was Mr. Perkis. He rose as soon as Percy entered and stood there waiting to be introduced. He was a pale, rather seedy-looking man with thin silver grey hair, very neatly brushed, and a thin summer suit, also very neatly brushed, at the same colour as his hair. "Oh, Monty," Doreen said, "this is Mr. What's your name?" "Boone." "Yes, Mr. Boone. He's a friend of Doris." "Any friend of Doris is a friend of—" Mr. Perkins began, but he was interrupted. "Hot, isn't it?" Percy remarked, fumbling for his cigarette case. "It's June, you know," Mr. Perkis told him. "Flaming June, remember? Smoke?" He had offered Doreen a cigarette before. Sorry, he'd offered cigarette... No, he hadn't. He'd offered Doreen a cigarette before he noticed that she was already smoking. She'd got that holder of hers. So he turned to Mr. Perkis. No, Mr. Perkis told him. "You're our visitor. Have one of these. They're Turkish." Percy took one and then wished he hadn't. It would have looked more independent, more man of the world had he laid one of his own. Or would it have been bad manners? He didn't know. "Nice little place you got here," Percy observed. Delightful, Mr. Perkis answered. "Such character." That was where Percy stopped. He didn't know what Mr. Perkis was talking about. There was a long, difficult pause. It was Doreen who broke it. "You're something to do with cars, aren't you?" she asked, when the silence couldn't get any longer. She felt like screaming already. "That's right," Percy replied again. Not a racing motorist?" Mr. Perkis inquired. "I've always had such an admiration—" But again he was interrupted. "I'm in the garage business," Percy told him. "Garages?" Mr. Perkis repeated. "Then you're one of those wonderful little men who know all about the inside of cars." Wonderful men? What was he getting at? Percy wondered. Or was that the way he always talked? He couldn't make it out. "I know a bit," he answered. Then there was another silence. Percy couldn't think of anything to say, and the silence seemed as though it would go on forever. "I had my car stolen once," Mr. Perkis said at last. Percy whistled. "Lot of it about," he remarked. "What was it?" "A Hillman Minx," Mr. Percy told him. "Blue one." Percy nodded his head knowingly. "That's easy," he said. As soon as he'd said it, he wished he hadn't. He'd been giving himself away if he wasn't careful, and the worst happened. Mr. Perkis became very interested at once, and then Doreen sat up and opened her eyes. "Do you know about stolen cars?" Mr. Perkis asked. "How exciting! I've always wondered how they managed about those number plates. I find criminology so fascinating." "I don't know anything, not personally," Percy answered. But there was silence again, and, to his irritation, he realised that he was blushing. It was during the silence that Doris came in, with Bill's arm around her shoulders. It was after 11 when he got back to Dulcimer Street. He hadn't wasted any more time up in that flat. As soon as he saw how things were, he walked out on them. "Second time I've been made a sucker because of Doris," he told himself ruefully. "That's why she wanted to leave home, wasn't it? Second time I've been made a sucker of." And as he turned at the gate, he met the Jossers' lodger coming down the front steps. They hadn't met face to face before. As things were, with Percy out at the garage all day and the lodger on night shift at the power station, it was pure coincidence or pure accident that he could have even met him now. "Evening," said the lodger. "Evening," Percy answered. And then as he went up the stairs, it suddenly occurred to him that he'd seen the lodger before somewhere. He turned and looked over his shoulder. What he saw was a plump, heavy-built young man wearing a sports jacket and a pair of flannels. Very exciting, eh? Very exciting. Chapter 23. Mr. Puddy was on guard. Theoretically on guard, that is, not actually. He was standing at the foot of the stairs with a drawn cutlass. He wasn't standing at the foot of the stairs with a drawn cutlass or anything like that. He was, as a matter of fact, sitting beside a gas ring waiting for his kettle to boil. But he was there on the spot in case he was wanted, and that was the point. He had just completed his midnight tour of the premises of the company, and he had popped into his little cubbyhole in the basement to snatch a bite of something before going off on his rounds again. While he was waiting, he was glancing through yesterday's paper. And what he saw upset him. There was too much happening for his taste. Reading the papers nowadays, you'd think that journalists were in charge of things instead of simply writing about them. There was a fresh surprise every morning. Missions were going and coming all the time. Pacts were being signed and repudiated. And to show that Mr. Chamberlain had really meant what he said about compulsory military training, the first batch of conscripts who had registered at the beginning of June were being called up today. There was a picture of one of them receiving his papers. He didn't look much older than a schoolboy. Cannon fodder. Oh, sorry, caddered fodder, Mr. Purdy said to himself, shaking his head. So much caddered fodder. He was glad for his own sake that he was 56. It wasn't likely they'd reach the 56s. They would want men of his age. They wouldn't want men of his... Sorry, I'm reading that a bit bad. He was glad for his sake that he was 56. It wasn't likely they'd reach the 56s. They wouldn't want men of his age in the trenches. Besides, they were all doing away with trenches this time. If there was going to be a war, it would all be fought in the air. The papers said so, and he couldn't fly. He was safe enough. This was going to be a young man's war. The papers said that also. But supposing they should try and rope him in, well, he'd got his answer for them. His feet. It was his feet that would save him. It saved him last time. Even the army doctor could tell that they were impossible. With feet like this, marching was out of the question. If any general in the British Army had wanted to start up something in a new sector, he'd have to send a car for Private Puddy. But getting killed in the trenches wasn't the only thing that could happen to a man in wartime, particularly in World War II. Civilians weren't going to be any safer than soldiers this time. Take air raids. Before he was through with it in his own little cubbyhole, his own little cubbyhole might have been turned into a shelter. Or poison gas on the big cities. Or germ warfare. Or invasion. The kettle boiled so suddenly and put the gas out, and Mr. Puddy made his tea. He was still depressed and apprehensive. And as he stirred, he thought, blockade, he reflected. That's another danger. Hundreds of submarines blockading everything. Nothing cubbing it. And what's left in the shops? The thought was so awful that he put the cup down and started staring in front of him. This peril, it was the likeliest of the lot, was the one that haunted him the most. From the way things are going, he might before next Christmas be slowly starving to death. He went clammy at the thought. And all through the night the terror played on him. It came to him in a dozen different forms. He remembered stories of shipwrecked soldiers, just skin and bone by the time they were rescued, of elderly, neglected invalids discovered by welfare officers, of natives in famine areas, of sentences of slow death in the Middle Ages. When morning came, he was down in his cubbyhole again, only this time he was writing. On the back of a postcard, he was jotting down a list. It read, 6 tins of condensed milk, 8 pounds of sugar, 3 packets of Quaker oats, 2 marmalade, 2 jam, 2 bovril, 6 tins of salmon, 2 pineapple, 2 peaches, 3 pounds of rice, 1 tongue Lazenby. And after the last entry, he drew a line and started off in a different category. He wrote 2 pairs of pyjamas, 2 pairs of thick socks, 2 wool combs, 1 pair of gloves, 1 blanket. Next to starving, being cold, really cold, the freezing to death stuff had always seemed to Mr. Puddy to be one of the most terrible ends that could happen to any man. And we are on chapter 24 when we come back tomorrow. My goodness, poor old Mr. Puddy. He's fearing the war, fearing being starved to death because he likes to eat, or being cold as anything. Gosh, there we go. Another episode. Poor old Percy is falling to bits. His nerves are getting at the better of him, but at least he knows that Doris has got another fella. And I can't remember what else we didn't get to the Jossers at all in today's episode, did we? Oh, yes, Mr. Squales at the séance was hilarious. Apparently hearing real voices, not just made-up ones, with Connie at his side. There you go. So that's all good. Julia says, I almost forgot that C and I had MMR jabs booked for flu today. Was... Oh, I can't read that. My eyes have gone funny. Was 5 minutes late, but all done now. We'll have to catch up with the chunk I missed. Is that, I suppose, is the MMR for Joe, presumably? What else have we got? The plot has become thick, says Anne H. Lee Lawson. No toilet rolls on Mr. Puddy's list. No, that's true. Great book, most enjoyable. Thank you, Richard. There we are. Marvellous. Great stuff. Thank you very much for joining me. Vogue Show tonight. Another reading of this, hopefully tomorrow. Take care. Enjoy what's left of the weather if you've got it. And I will see you anon. Thanks for joining me today. Take care and look after yourselves. Bye for now. Bye-bye.